The locks on my own front door had been changed, and there, stacked on the curb like garbage waiting for pickup, were 11 years of my life folded into cardboard boxes soaked through by the morning dew. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the idea that people can find their way back to hope even after the worst has happened, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone new joins us in believing that even broken things can be made whole again. Now let me tell you how I got here, standing on my own lawn at 9 in the morning, holding a suitcase from a 14-hour flight, staring at my life packed into boxes that weren't even mine to pack. My name is Grant Ellison, and for the past 4 months I had been working an overseas contract in Rotterdam, supervising the installation of marine engineering systems for a shipping company that paid triple what I could make at home. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. My wife, Marissa, and I had talked about it for weeks before I left, sitting at our kitchen table with a legal pad between us, writing out the math of what 4 months abroad could mean for our future. We had a mortgage that felt like an anchor around our necks, a car loan we were still fighting down to nothing, and a dream, quiet but persistent, of maybe starting a family once we weren't drowning in debt every month. Marissa had held my hand across the table and told me she would be fine, that she was strong, that 4 months would pass like a long weekend if we stayed close on the phone and counted down together. I believed her. I still believe she meant it when she said it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from 3,000 miles away with a 6-hour time difference and a work schedule that ate 12 hours out of every day, was that while I was gone, Marissa's parents had been quietly unraveling at the seams of their own lives, and that unraveling was about to land, uninvited and unannounced, directly on top of mine. Marissa's father, Roland Colby, had run a mid-sized construction supply company for almost 30 years, the kind of business that let him buy a lake house and send Marissa to a good college without loans. But 2 years before I left for Rotterdam, Roland had made an investment in a business partner's expansion plan that turned out to be built on nothing but confidence and bad paperwork. The partner disappeared with what capital remained, the business folded under an avalanche of debt Roland hadn't fully disclosed even to his own wife, and by the time I boarded my flight to the Netherlands, Roland and his wife Vivian were 3 months behind on their own mortgage and quietly terrified of losing the house they'd lived in for over 2 decades. I want to pause here and say something important, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened afterward. Roland Colby was not a cruel man. He was proud, and pride does strange things to people when it's cornered. Vivian, for her part, was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life being told that a well-run household was the measure of a woman's worth, and the idea of admitting financial ruin to anyone, let alone to her own daughter, felt to her like admitting she had failed at the one thing she was supposed to be good at. So instead of asking for help honestly, they did what frightened, proud people sometimes do. They let the situation get worse in silence until silence was no longer an option. Marissa told me later, in pieces, over weeks of difficult conversations, that her parents had shown up at our door 6 weeks into my contract, in the middle of a rainstorm, with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond the next few nights. She said her mother had been crying so hard she could barely speak, and her father, a man Marissa had never once seen with tears in his eyes, had stood on our porch soaked through and said only, "We have nowhere else to go." What was Marissa supposed to do? She let them in. Of course she let them in. I would have done the same thing, and if you're watching this and you have parents you love, I think you would too. The problem was never that she opened the door. The problem was everything that came after. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. A week, maybe 2, while Roland sorted out what he called a cash flow situation with the bank. Marissa didn't tell me right away, and I understand why now even though it hurt terribly when I found out. She didn't want to worry me while I was overseas, didn't want me to feel torn between my job and rushing home to a problem that she was sure would resolve itself. She has since told me, with her voice breaking, that she thought she was protecting our marriage by handling it alone. What she didn't realize, what none of us realized until it was almost too late, was that a week can become a month, and a month can become a slow, creeping occupation of a home, inch by inch, decision by decision, until one day you don't recognize your own front hallway. By the second month, Vivian had rearranged our kitchen cabinets to her own liking, claiming that our system made no sense and hers was more efficient. By the third month, Roland had taken over the garage as a workspace for a small side business he was trying to start, selling refurbished tools online, and my woodworking bench, the one my own late father had built with his hands and given to me the year before he passed, had been moved out to the side yard to make room, left exposed to whatever weather came. Marissa told me she fought about the small things constantly but felt she couldn't fight about the big thing, which was simply, "Are you leaving?" Because every time she came close to asking, her mother would begin crying about the house they might lose, and her father would go quiet and wounded in a way that made Marissa feel like the cruelest daughter alive for even considering asking her own parents to leave. And then there was Trent. Marissa's younger brother, 26 years old, had moved back in with their parents 8 months before all of this began, after losing a marketing job and burning through his savings on things Marissa described, carefully, as choices. When Roland and Vivian moved into our house, Trent came with them, because apparently the idea of Trent living alone had never been seriously considered by anyone in that family. Trent was not cruel either, not in the way you might expect from a story like this. He was, if anything, aimless, drifting, a grown man who had never quite been asked to grow up, and in the absence of any structure, he simply filled the space he was given, which in this case happened to be my home office, where he set up a gaming console on the desk where I used to do my engineering drafting on weekends. I learned all of this slowly, in scattered phone calls that grew shorter and more strained as the weeks went by. I noticed it before I understood it. Marissa's voice, once quick and warm and full of little jokes about her day, became careful, clipped, like she was choosing each word from a very small approved list. When I asked if everything was all right, she always said yes, fine, just tired, work is busy, mom needs help with something. I told myself it was normal. Marriages survive distance if you trust each other, and I trusted her completely. What I didn't account for was that trust doesn't stop other things from happening. It just means you don't see them coming. The specific event that finally broke the surface happened during my third month away, though I wouldn't learn the full truth of it until I was standing on my own lawn weeks later. Marissa had, in a moment of genuine desperation, finally asked her father directly when he and Vivian planned to find their own place. She told me she asked gently, kindly, trying not to wound him, simply because our savings account, the one meant to be a cushion for our future, had begun quietly draining to cover extra groceries, extra utilities, and a $2,000 loan Roland had asked to borrow against a business opportunity he swore would pay it back within a month. Roland's reaction, according to what Marissa told me later with tears streaming down her face, was to accuse her of turning her back on family in their hour of need, of caring more about money than blood, of becoming, in his exact and devastating words, just like her husband's cold, calculating side of the family. Marissa said that comment cut her in a way she hadn't expected, because it painted me, a man he barely knew and had never taken the time to understand, as some kind of villain simply for being far away, working hard, trying to build something for our future. After that fight, something in Marissa seemed to give way. She told me she stopped pushing, stopped asking, started simply enduring, because the alternative felt like choosing between her husband and her parents, and she wasn't ready to make that choice out loud, even though, in 1,000 small silent ways, she was already making it every single day by staying quiet. I came home 2 weeks earlier than originally planned, because the Rotterdam project finished ahead of schedule and my company offered to fly me back immediately rather than have me sit idle in a foreign country. I didn't tell Marissa the exact day. I wanted to surprise her. I imagined walking through our front door and seeing her face light up, imagined dropping my suitcase in the hallway and holding her for the first time in months, imagined a homecoming built entirely out of relief and love. I landed at 6 in the morning after a red-eye flight, took a cab straight from the airport because I couldn't stand to wait even the extra hour it would take Marissa to come get me, and that is how I found myself standing on my own front lawn at 9 in the morning, staring at boxes on the curb, a for sale sign nowhere in sight but a locksmith's business card taped, almost mockingly, to my own front door. I want you to imagine that feeling for just a moment. For months of hard, lonely, exhausting work, done entirely so that my wife and I could build a better life together, and I come home to find that my own house key doesn't fit my own front door anymore. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, my suitcase handle still gripped in my hand, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I saw my clothes, still on hangers, draped over the top of an open box, damp from the early morning dew. I saw a framed photograph of my late father, the glass cracked down the middle, resting against a box marked, in Marissa's handwriting, Grant, miscellaneous. I saw my woodworking tools, the ones passed down from my father to me, thrown loosely into a plastic storage bin without any care for their edges or their history. I knocked. I want to be honest and tell you that my first instinct was not anger, though anger would come later. My first instinct was confusion so total that it felt almost like a kind of grief, the sense that the world had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking and I no longer understood the shape of my own life. A woman I didn't recognize, though I would soon learn was Vivian Colby, opened the door partway, chain still latched, and looked at me the way you might look at a stranger asking for directions, polite but entirely unmoved. "Can I help you?" she asked, and I remember the strange formality of it, as though I were a delivery driver rather than the man whose name was on the mortgage. "This is my house," I said, and I heard my own voice crack slightly on the word "my," because saying it out loud made the wrongness of the situation feel even more surreal. "Where's Marissa? Where's my wife?" Vivian's expression flickered, just slightly, something like discomfort passing behind her eyes before she smoothed it back into composure. "Marissa's at work," she said. "She didn't mention you were coming home today." "She didn't know," I said. "I flew back early. Can you please open the door?" There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear, somewhere behind her in the house, the sound of a television turned up loud, laughter that wasn't mine, footsteps that weren't Marissa's. Finally the chain slid back and the door opened, and I walked into my own home like a guest, like a man being granted permission to enter a place he had spent 11 years paying for. The house did not look like my house. The furniture had been rearranged into configurations I didn't recognize. There were unfamiliar coats hung on hooks that used to hold Marissa's scarves. There was a stack of mail on the counter with Roland Colby's name on nearly every envelope. And there, sitting on my living room couch with his feet up on my coffee table, was a young man I would later learn was Trent, controller in hand, who looked up at me with the mild, unbothered curiosity of someone glancing at a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. "You must be Grant," Trent said, not unkindly, but with a casualness that somehow made everything worse. "Didn't know you were coming back today." I didn't answer him. I walked through my own living room, past my own kitchen, and out to the backyard, where I found my woodworking bench sitting exposed under the open sky, one leg already beginning to warp from rain exposure, my father's old hand tools scattered across it like they meant nothing to anyone but me. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the wood grain my father had sanded smooth decades ago, and I felt something in my chest crack open, not just anger but a specific, particular grief, the grief of watching something sacred be treated as clutter. I called Marissa. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright with the ordinary rhythms of a workday, and when I said, "I'm home," there was a silence on the other end so complete that I could hear her breathing change. "You're home now?" "Today?" she said, and I could hear the panic rising underneath the words. "Grant, I need you to just, please, stay calm. I can explain everything. I'm leaving work right now." I want to tell you honestly that in that moment, standing in my own backyard beside my father's ruined workbench, I did not feel calm, and I did not promise her that I would be. I told her that her parents had my things on the curb and my father's photograph had a cracked frame and there was a strange man playing video games on my couch, and I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether she had lost her mind while I was gone. She started crying on the phone, and through the crying she told me it wasn't like that it had happened slowly, that she had tried, that she hadn't known how to tell me over the phone from 3,000 miles away, that she had been afraid I would be angry, that she had been afraid of exactly this moment for weeks and had somehow convinced herself it might never come. Marissa arrived home 23 minutes later, and I know it was 23 minutes because I stood in that backyard and watched every one of them pass, trying to steady the storm inside my chest before I had to look my wife in the eyes. When she came around the side of the house and saw me standing there, she stopped walking entirely, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She looked exhausted in a way I hadn't heard in her voice on any of our phone calls, dark circles beneath her eyes, her shoulders curved inward like someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. And despite everything, despite the boxes and the broken frame and the stranger on my couch, the first thing I felt when I saw her face was not rage. It was worry. Because whatever had happened in this house over the past 4 months, it had clearly cost her something too, something I hadn't been there to see happening in real time. "I'm so sorry," she said, and her voice broke completely on the word sorry. I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I tried to say something, it turned into this whole thing, and I kept thinking I could fix it before you got home, and now you're here and it's not fixed and I don't even know where to start. I want to tell you that I responded with grace in that moment, but I didn't, not entirely. I asked her how her parents' financial problems had become more important than our marriage. I asked her why my father's tools were sitting outside like garbage. I asked her whose idea it had been to change the locks, because surely, whatever else had happened, she would never have agreed to lock her own husband out of his own home. Her answer to that last question was the one that softened something in me, even in the middle of my anger, because she told me, through tears, that she hadn't known about the locks at all, that her father had done it 2 days earlier without telling her, apparently believing that if the locks were changed and the house felt more settled, more permanent, it would be harder for anyone, meaning me, to insist on changes when I returned. She said she had come home from work the day before to find it already done, and when she confronted her father about it, he told her it was simply a precaution given how much of their belongings were now in the house, and that surely I would understand once I saw how hard things had been for the family. That was the moment I understood the true shape of what had happened in my absence. It wasn't simply that Marissa's parents had needed temporary shelter and things had gotten complicated. It was that Roland Colby, a proud man cornered by his own failures, had slowly, methodically, perhaps without even fully admitting it to himself, begun treating my house as though it were becoming his house, and had used his daughter's love and guilt as the soil in which that belief could grow unchallenged. We stood in that backyard for a long time, Marissa and I, talking in the particular hushed, urgent way that people talk when they're trying to solve 4 months of accumulated damage in a single conversation. She told me everything then, all of it, the rainstorm and the suitcases, the garage takeover, the kitchen cabinets, the $2,000 loan, the accusation that I was cold and calculating, Trent's aimless drift into our home office. She told me she had felt trapped between the 2 people she loved most in the world, her husband and her parents, and that every day she hadn't told me the full truth had felt like another brick added to a wall she was building around her own heart, a wall meant to protect her from having to choose, but which had only made everything heavier and lonelier in the meantime. I listened. I want to say I listened well, though I'm sure my face betrayed how much pain I was in throughout. And when she finished, I told her the truth, which was that I was angry, deeply and justifiably angry, but that my anger was not really about the boxes or the workbench or even the locks. My anger was about the silence. For months of silence, of small evasions, of a woman I loved carrying an entire collapsing situation alone because she was afraid of what honesty might cost her. I told her that I understood why she hadn't wanted to worry me from overseas, but that a marriage isn't a thing you protect by hiding its wounds from the person who loves you. A marriage is a thing you protect by trusting the other person enough to say, "This is hard, I need you," even when you're far away and there's nothing either of you can do about the distance in that moment except hold the truth together instead of alone. Marissa cried harder then, not the defensive tears of someone caught in a lie, but the exhausted tears of someone finally setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was optional to carry it at all. She told me she was sorry in a way that felt different from every apology she'd offered in the previous 20 minutes, less about managing my anger and more about genuinely reckoning with what she'd allowed to happen, not just to me, but to us, to the trust between us that we had always considered unbreakable. We went inside together after that, and I want to tell you that what followed was a single dramatic confrontation that solved everything in one afternoon, but real life rarely works that cleanly, and I think stories that pretend otherwise do a disservice to anyone actually living through something like this. What actually happened was 3 days of difficult, sometimes ugly, always necessary conversations, first between Marissa and me, working to rebuild the specific trust that had eroded, and then, once we were united again as a couple rather than as two people each managing the situation alone, between the two of us and Roland and Vivian together. That first conversation with Roland was the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my life, harder even than watching my father get sicker over the final months before he passed. Roland sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where I imagine he once sat as an honored guest, and I watched a proud man's face cycle through defensiveness, indignation, and finally, slowly, something that looked almost like shame. I told him I understood what it meant to be afraid of losing everything you'd built. I told him I understood, more than he might expect, what it felt like to watch a life's work threaten to collapse, because I had watched my own father struggle through 2 brutal years of near bankruptcy in his own small engineering firm when I was a teenager, years my father had never fully talked about until he was much older, years that had taught me, watching him, that pride is a poor substitute for honesty when your family is on the line. I told Roland that I did not want him and Vivian to end up on the street, that I would help them find a real, sustainable solution, but that the solution could not be indefinite, unspoken occupation of a house that belonged to his daughter and me, built slowly through guilt and silence rather than agreement and honesty. Roland did not respond well at first. He raised his voice, told me I didn't understand what it meant to fail your family, told me that a real son-in-law would simply open his home without conditions and without a calendar. I felt anger rise in me at that, sharp and immediate, but I thought of my father then, of something he used to say to me when I was young and quick to fight, that the strongest men he ever knew were not the ones who won every argument, but the ones who could stay steady enough to still hear the other person even in the middle of being wronged. So instead of matching Roland's volume, I lowered my voice, and I told him, as gently as I could manage, that I did understand what it meant to fail your family, because I had watched my own father live through exactly that fear, and what my father had ultimately taught me was that the families who survive those seasons are the ones who talk about the fear honestly instead of letting it curdle into silence, or pride, or the quiet, creeping belief that someone else's home has become your own by simply staying long enough. Vivian, who had been sitting silently through most of this exchange, began to cry at that point, and it was her tears, not Roland's arguments, that finally broke something open in the room. She told us that she had been so ashamed, for so long, of what had happened to Roland's business, that she had convinced herself that if she simply kept the house running smoothly, kept things organized and comfortable, it would somehow earn their place in our home, would somehow make up for the fact that they had nothing left to offer but their presence. She said she hadn't realized, until she said it out loud at that table, how much that quiet shame had been driving decisions that looked, from the outside, like entitlement, but which had actually been born from a desperate, aching fear of being a burden with nothing to offer in return. That confession changed the temperature of the entire conversation. Marissa reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and I watched something soften in Roland's face as his wife's tears did what my arguments hadn't quite managed to do. We spent the next 2 hours, all 4 of us, working through an actual plan, not a vague promise of soon, but specific steps, specific timelines. Roland agreed to sit down with me the following week to look honestly at his finances, something he admitted he had been avoiding even privately for months because looking too closely felt like confirming his own failure. I offered to help him explore a small business loan restructuring, using some of the industry contacts I'd built over years of engineering work, and I offered, more importantly, simply to listen, on ordinary weekday evenings, the way a son-in-law might if the whole situation had begun with an honest conversation instead of a rainstorm and a silent unraveling. We agreed, together, that Roland and Vivian would move into a rental property nearby, modest but comfortable, within 6 weeks, funded partly by a small loan against their remaining assets and partly, I insisted, by a contribution from Marissa and me, not as charity but as an investment in getting them back on their feet with dignity rather than desperation. Trent's situation took longer to resolve, and I won't pretend that part of the story ended in a single tidy conversation either. Trent was harder to reach, not because he was cruel, but because he had simply never been asked, by anyone, to imagine a different version of his own life. It took several more weeks, and eventually a rather blunt conversation between the two of us, man to man, where I told him honestly that watching him drift through his 20s without direction reminded me of watching a boat with no anchor and no rudder, going wherever the current happened to push it, and that I didn't say this to hurt him but because I suspected, somewhere beneath the video games and the aimlessness, he actually wanted more for himself than what he currently had. That conversation planted something, slowly. Trent eventually enrolled in a certification program for industrial electrical work, something practical and in demand, and moved into a small apartment of his own within 4 months, the first time in his adult life he had lived entirely independently. I wish I could tell you that my own marriage healed as quickly and cleanly as Trent's career path did, but the truth is more complicated and, I think, more honest. Marissa and I spent months rebuilding something that had quietly cracked while I was overseas. We went to a handful of counseling sessions together, something neither of us had ever needed before, sitting in an office with a counselor named Dr. Adeline Ferris, working through the specific mechanics of what had gone wrong. Dr. Ferris said something to us in our third session that I've carried with me ever since. She said that the danger in our situation had never really been Marissa's parents, difficult as they were, and had never really been the distance of my overseas work, hard as that had been on both of us. The real danger, she said, had been the silence Marissa built as a kind of emotional insulation, believing she was protecting our marriage, when in fact silence between people who love each other rarely protects anything. It simply delays the reckoning and makes it heavier when it finally arrives. Marissa took that lesson seriously, more seriously than I think she had ever taken anything in our marriage before. She began, in small deliberate ways, practicing the exact opposite of what had gotten us into this situation. When something felt hard, she said it out loud, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it risked an argument. I did the same in return, working harder to notice, on our phone calls during any future travel, the specific quality of hesitation in her voice rather than assuming, as I once had, that no news simply meant good news. Here's something I want to tell you honestly, because I think it matters for anyone watching who has been hurt by someone they love, and who is wondering whether forgiveness is even possible after something like this. 6 months after I came home to find my things on the curb, we hosted Thanksgiving at our house, and Roland and Vivian came, along with Trent, now settled into his own apartment and his new training program, visibly lighter than he had been in years. My father's workbench, repaired and refinished by my own hands over a series of quiet Saturday mornings, stood back in its rightful place in the garage, and before dinner, without my asking, Roland walked out to the garage alone and stood looking at it for a long moment. When I found him there, he told me, quietly, that he was sorry, genuinely sorry, not the defensive apology of a man caught in a corner but the plain apology of a man who had finally allowed himself to see clearly what he had done. He said that fear had made him small in a way he wasn't proud of, and that he hoped, given time, he could become the kind of father-in-law who added to my life rather than one who had nearly cost me the most important relationship in it. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, not because the hurt had disappeared entirely, because some scars simply become part of the landscape of a relationship rather than fading away completely, but because I had come to understand something important in the months since that terrible morning on my own lawn. Forgiveness isn't a reward you give to people who deserve it perfectly. It's a decision you make because carrying resentment forward costs you something precious, and because the people we love are, all of us, capable of failing each other out of fear, out of pride, out of silence, and still capable of finding their way back if we leave the door open long enough for them to walk through it honestly. Marissa and I are stronger now than we were before any of this happened, and I don't say that as a tidy bow tied on a difficult story, but because it's simply true. We talk more openly now than we ever did in our first years of marriage. We have an understanding, hard one, that no fear, no family obligation, no desire to protect the other person from worry is worth the risk of silence. We had our first child 8 months ago, a daughter we named Josephine, and on quiet mornings when I hold her in the nursery, I sometimes think about that suitcase on my own front lawn, about the boxes soaked through with dew, about my father's cracked photograph, and I feel something that isn't quite gratitude for what happened, because I would never wish that pain on anyone, but is something adjacent to it. A recognition that the very worst morning of my marriage became, eventually, the beginning of its truest foundation. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear it. Before you go, I want to ask you to leave a comment about a time in your own life when honesty, even painful honesty, ended up saving something you loved. I read every single one, and I think there's something powerful in knowing that so many of us have walked through our own version of finding the locks changed on a life we thought we understood completely. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Our family of viewers keeps growing because stories like this one remind us that even when the people we love hurt us, even when we come home to find our whole world rearranged without our permission, there is almost always a path back to something whole, if we're brave enough to speak honestly and patient enough to forgive. Thank you for spending this time with me and with this story. I'll see you in the next one.